Hello, everyone, and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Director of Communications at PFLAG National. Great to have you with us again this week for another episode of our show. As always, I am joined by my friend and colleague, Jean-Marie Navetta, our Director of Learning and Inclusion.
Liz Owen.
Jean-Marie Navetta.
Just in case we forgot our names, we know them now.
Indeed,
How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm good. Technically looking at vacation, so I'm feeling particularly happy, but I'm super excited about today's conversation because we haven't done this one before, and I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion.
Well, I will take my jealousy over your vacation off camera. Have a great show.
Thanks, Liz. We'll see you later. Hey, everybody. My name is Jean-Marie Navetta. My pronouns are she and her if you speak Spanish, ella, and I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. Every single week, we get together to talk about something related to LGBTQ equality and inclusion. And this week, we are talking about international issues and looking at LGBTQ rights, progress, and challenges around the globe. So for those of you who always read our article and look at some of the questions, the article that we picked out was it was published through Reuters, and it was an article about the UK and how very recently they've just canceled a big global LGBTQ plus conference over trans conversion therapy. So essentially what happened was a significantly large conference had been planned, and at the last minute, people started to back out of it because the United Kingdom is having a big debate over whether trans people should be included and covered in legislation that bans conversion therapy practices. Now, we're not completely focusing on that, but I thought it was an interesting article that really highlighted to people very much how issues are playing out differently depending on where you are, and it's affecting the community in lots of different ways. And one of the reasons we're having this conversation today is that May 17th is the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia. So that day was actually established in 2004, and it gives us a great reason to look around the globe. The purpose of the day actually is to draw attention to the violence and discrimination faced by LGBTQ people when it comes to the way they are treated, both under the law and culturally. It was actually, May 17th was actually selected, and this is kind of an interesting point, to commemorate the World Health Organization's decision in 1990 to declassify homosexuality as a mental illness. And today, this day is observed in more than 130 countries, including 37 of which still make same-sex acts illegal. So we are going to get into a conversation about what is going on around the globe. And we have two fantastic guests with us today. We have Moninne Griffith, who is the CEO of Belong To in Ireland. And we have Aruna, who's the Executive Director of Desi Rainbow Parents and Allies. And I'd love to welcome them now.
Hi, lovely to be here with you.
Hello, it's so good to see you both.
Thank you for inviting us.
But thank you. Before we go any further, for people who do not know about your organizations, I would love for you to tell them a little bit about what your organizations do, the scope of work that they're covering, and how people can find them. And Aruna, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Jean-Marie. First of all, thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here in this space. So I founded an organization within the United States called Desi Rainbow Parents and Allies. Desi is a term that we use as an in-group term for South Asian folks. And these are people who are from the South Asian subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. And the reason for founding this organization is because while we are very different sometimes in terms of our context, our national origin, there's a lot of cultural similarity in the kinds of barriers that are there for family acceptance of LGBTQ folks. And when my own kid came out as first queer and then as trans, there was very little there that was support for me. And I felt the need to build this kind of support system. We are now a diasporic organization, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about it when you ask these questions. But really, we serve folks in the South Asian diaspora in multiple countries. So that's what Desi Rainbow does.
Thank you. And Moninne, could you tell us a little bit about Belong To?
Sure. So we're a youth organization. We work nationally across the Republic of Ireland. We started as a small youth group for LGBT young people 19 years ago. And over that time, we've grown and grown, and we now run youth services in Dublin, and we support a network of youth services, youth clubs and groups across Ireland, over 50 groups of those. We also do a lot of work, apart from the youth work and the one-to-one work with young people. We do a lot of capacity building and training in schools with school programs and other youth services to build safer spaces for LGBT young people. And we do a lot of lobbying and campaigning work as well. So on a broad range of topics that have an impact on young queer people's lives in Ireland. So legislation, policy, systems and structures, to reduce homophobia, transphobia and biphobia, and the impacts that they have on LGBTQ plus young people.
Thank you. And I have to admit, I did not know a lot about your organization, and we were looking for different people who we haven't spoken to. And when I got onto the website, I was like, all of this is happening, and I never knew about any of it. So thank you so much for being with us. So I want to start by talking a little bit, using this week's article that we had to kind of make a jumping off point for our conversation. So the article really detailed how dissent over the treatment of trans people, so the inclusion of trans people in some really important legislation, caused a split so significant that it actually caused the cancellation of this pretty large conference that had been planned. So I'm interested to know, as we look at this, I think it really raises issues of unity inside of our communities, of who is included and who sometimes gets left by the wayside. And maybe, Aruna, we could start with you. I'd love to know, are you seeing divides like this one? Because this one really blew up very publicly, and it had legs, and it got some conversations going. So is this showing up at all in the work that you're seeing, or do you see these kind of things influencing the work that you're doing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, one of these things is, being in the space as an ally, one of the things I was really struck about when I entered the space is that there is such a divide between, not necessarily divide, but a lack of understanding, lack of cohesion between the cis community and the trans communities. And it's really interesting to me that this plays out obviously in the Western countries that we are talking about here, like, obviously the UK and Ireland and the United States. But in India, which is where I know the most about in terms of how, advocacy is occurring around these issues, there is actually a very strange intersection going on here, because there is a very strong and established tradition of trans people, trans feminine people particularly. And those folks actually are able to, in some ways, have some political power. There's legislation, policy changes that are very focused on trans acceptance and equality, whereas there is absolutely there's very little progress being made in the cis LGBT space in terms of equality, access. Obviously, very simple things like the anti-sodomy laws that were in place all through colonial rule were very recently removed. And so there's a little bit of progress being made in that context. But I find that same-sex advocacy is limited compared to the kinds of progress that's been made in trans legislation and policy. So I find that interesting here, whereas in my work in the United States, the nexus that you folks are talking about here, where there is like somewhat acceptance of cis LGBT identities and very limited acceptance of trans identities, is very much happening, within our South Asian community as well. So strange combination of things here.
It is interesting how sometimes discrimination gets exported and is part of the colonializing experience. Moninne, has this shown up in the work that you are seeing? Are you seeing this divide develop, and how are people responding?
You know what? It's funny. I think 5 years ago, it was safer to be trans in Ireland than it is today. And I think, we have really quite progressive gender recognition legislation for trans folks over 18. It's an administrative self-declaration process, hard fought for and won by the trans community in Ireland. But things have kind of stalled and even gone backwards in some ways. I'm not sure. What I'm seeing is, and I think I could be wrong, but I think what's happened in the UK and partly in the US as well is it seems to be kind of an alt-right narrative, anti-trans narrative. And what they're very good at doing then is targeting groups of individuals, stirring up fears amongst them. So in Ireland, for example, stirring up fears amongst activists in the gender-based violence sector, also then trying to get into the LGBT sector and create a divide. I haven't noticed it that much, especially amongst the young people that we work with. I think young queer people feel huge solidarity with their trans friends and siblings. So definitely amongst younger queer people, there is no divide. They feel very much a great sense of solidarity. What I have noticed, I suppose, is maybe amongst some older, my age and older folks, there has been some, questioning and curiosity, sometimes from, no agenda, just genuine questions. But I think that has been stoked up by this narrative that's coming over. And so in the same way as, first and second wave feminism, there was a discussion about what is a woman, should lesbians be included in our feminist cause. I think those kind of questions are almost coming up again now in lesbian feminist spaces, around inclusion of trans women and what that means then for feminism in general. But it's a small minority voice at the moment, but certainly not one that we should ignore, something that we need to be really cognizant about, and to for people with genuine fears and concerns to be able to address those. But hold firm and also explain that some of these fears are the exact same things that we heard back in when we were fighting for marriage equality around gay and lesbian folks. It's their fear-based, it's the fear of the unknown, the fear of the different, and what that means. So it's about having those conversations and addressing people's concerns, so that they can understand that it's all around the same thing. It comes back to misogyny and sexism and homophobia and transphobia, all have their roots in the same thing, the fear of difference and power differential. So yeah.
Thank you. I was sort of hoping that was not the answer. I have to admit this. I was looking for, it's not an issue, but I think that we are looking at a real divide that's happening. It was just last week I read 2 articles written by gay men sort of attributing the lack of progress to the trans community. And as I read it, I thought, you have completely bought in part and parcel to all of the lies that our opposition has said. And now you're out there speaking as though you speak for our whole community. And it's very upsetting to see. But I don't want to just focus on the negative. I think it's worth highlighting that. And it's worth knowing where these arguments are coming from, what they're fueled by, and how they're playing into existing structures. But I also want to talk about some of the good news. In fact, during COVID, we actually saw some of the most remarkable organizing happening for our community, because the nature of online organizing allowed more people to opt into things. So I would love to see, the organizing that happened wasn't just about marriage. We saw a lot of non-discrimination legislation being addressed, more trans inclusion being addressed, talking about gender more broadly. So what is some of the good stuff that you are seeing happening? I think right now we are at a dark time. We tend to fixate on all of the negatives. So Aruna, where's the progress happening? What is making you excited about the changes that you are seeing in the space that you're working in?
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up, because I do think, we tend to kind of there's this catastrophizing in many ways, because we are so worried about the things that are happening that are attacks on our community. One of the things that I'm seeing, not necessarily in terms of policy or legislation or anything, within the South Asian diaspora, I'm seeing a lot more acceptance of LGBT identities, not necessarily trans identities again, but just the other day I was talking to a friend who's actually she's an officiant, she's a priest, a Hindu priest who performs marriages, and she herself is queer. And she was talking about this big uptick in weddings that she's being asked to officiate, queer weddings, and that are no longer, before it used to be in her context and in the generation that she comes from, a handful of people came for these weddings, right? It was like people, the uncles and aunts who were willing to show up at a wedding that was so not appropriate and or what they consider appropriate. But now a larger swath of the community is accepting, is willing to show up, is willing to celebrate it in a cultural way, in a religious way, which I think is a beautiful thing to see, because once upon a time, it was really hard to like find community members showing up to celebrate LGBTQ identity, specifically in the context of weddings and cultural events and festivals and things like that. So I think that's a real positive aspect. The other thing that I'm seeing, which I'm sure most of PFLAG is seeing, is that families are being sensitized to LGBTQ identities much earlier. So before, it used to be like, you showed up at a PFLAG meeting or, at our Desi Rainbow meetings because your child was an adult and had come out to you recently. Now you have, the family with the youngest child who showed up recently to the Desi Rainbow meeting has a 6-year-old who's gender diverse. And so that is happening far more frequently. I think that's a wonderful sign, because really what it means is even if the parent is struggling, they're noticing something and they're able to address it much earlier on, which is, I'm hoping, will make a huge difference in these children's lives because they will have family support and hopefully have a completely different trajectory from the folks who have had to struggle until adulthood to have their own lives and build their own identities. So
I think if there's ever a case for people starting these conversations, I think this is part of it, because I think as people realize this is becoming a piece of the family conversation so much earlier than a lot of people imagined, I think it begins to shift the lens on it. It makes people want to ask questions earlier on, regardless of where you're coming from, regardless of the community. And I think that's kind of exciting. I find that we get a lot more questions about how do I talk to my very young children? And that, I think, is a really good sign. Moninne, what about you? What kind of good news are you seeing? What kind of progress are you seeing? Where is that happening?
Well, like you were talking about, Aruna, we are also seeing that in Ireland. So younger people coming out, younger, I suppose, with greater visibility, more understanding, more awareness. Young people may have the language now to describe how they're feeling different or why they're feeling different. Or so we have parents with younger children getting in contact with us, which I think is wonderful. Coming out is still the number one issue for the young people that we are supporting. So that fear of rejection and that whole, which might lead to isolation and then a plethora of mental health problems. So the younger, I suppose, that a young person comes out or realizes that and is able to come out to family and get the support and be accepted and loved for who they are, the better it is for everyone, right? So that's a really positive thing. The other kind of things then we're seeing is schools, much more increased appetite in schools to make sure that their schools are safe and supportive. So we had a celebration with some post-primary or high schools there last week, as some of them had graduated through a safe and supportive program with us. So I think there's much more school leadership and desire to make sure that schools are safe and supportive places for students, certainly in high school. And we have many calls for primary school, which is for children aged 6 to 12 in Ireland. So much more awareness about that. The other thing that we're seeing in Ireland as well is discussions around hate crime, offline and online. So there's legislation being discussed in our parliament at the moment in relation to tightening all that up, and our online safety as well. And in Europe, there has been some success as well around digital services. So ensuring that digital platforms have a much greater role in regulating content online, so harmful content, which of course we know, globally, but certainly in the US, UK, and Ireland, LGBT plus young people can, it's a place that they find community, they find friends, they find out more about themselves. So it's important that those spaces are safe. But we know that there is a lot of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia that happens online. So going in the right direction, lots of work to be done, but certainly a lot of that is giving me hope.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's interesting as you were talking, I was looking at some of the other things that we wanted to talk about today, and one of them actually has to do with legislation. So I appreciate you queuing that up and that it is part of the conversation in Ireland. One of the things that I always watch is when bad legislation gets introduced in the United States, I pay attention to who is behind it, and then I pay attention to where do I see it pop up in other places. We have seen plenty of examples, one of the most extreme ones being Uganda, where it was American voices and in many cases American money behind the introduction of anti-LGBTQ legislation in other countries. Unfortunately, we are going through a very bad time here in the States. We've had over 200 pieces of anti-LGBTQ legislation introduced just this year, a lot of which has actually moved forward, some of which has officially become law. As you look at these things, knowing that this pattern of exporting homophobia and transphobia and biphobia is a very real thing, does this concern you that it is going to start showing up in other places where you're doing your work because of the American influence? And I know when we get into Southeast Asia, we are talking about a broad swath of area, but Aruna, is this something that people are watching and do you feel they're concerned about?
Yeah, no, I think as you mentioned, this is a difficult area to pinpoint exactly like where this kind of cultural exchange is happening. So, as I briefly mentioned at the beginning, so all these South Asian countries have had laws in the books that are all colonial era laws, mostly anti-sodomy, but in general focused on essentially criminalizing any kind of same-sex behavior. So slowly those barriers are beginning to crumble. India is the first country actually in South Asia to have removed that criminalization, and the hope is that other countries will begin to change that policy as well. However, the diaspora, that is essentially like folks who are from South Asia but live across the world, are in very different contexts. I mean, there's a huge South Asian diaspora from the Caribbean countries and from South America and Guyana. Then there are folks who are from obviously, the Western countries, and there are folks in Australia and New Zealand, many of whom are kind of grappling with the reality on the ground where there is somewhat progressive legislation in the mainstream, but it doesn't necessarily percolate. And one of the things that happens in immigrant communities, diasporic communities, which I have personally observed in my own life, is that we tend to kind of live in bubbles. So we carry the values of our upbringing to wherever we go. So regardless of whatever progressive legislation policies there in the countries that we live, we don't necessarily allow it to intrude into our bubbles. So there's a very kind of like different situation going on here with like cultural exchange, understanding. And as I mentioned, trans identities have had some traditional respect in South Asia. That respect is not necessarily translating in the diaspora because we are now in countries where there is a huge amount of disrespect and, obviously transphobia. And so while we are okay with the ritualized roles of trans people in South Asian tradition, we're not okay with our children coming out as trans.
Interesting.
So yeah, so lots of differences going on here. And I think in this United States in particular, there is definitely a schism between cis LGB folks who are, really kind of like trying to move forward in certain ways, and the trans and non-binary communities who are seeing essentially that they're not represented, that they're not at the table. So a lot of work needs to be done, both with the cultural shift and with the policy shift. And I'm hoping that at some point, we will have some kind of like global diasporic understanding of what our traditions mean to us and what we have to do to actually practice the kinds of like, positive, affirmative behaviors that we need to do to make our kids feel accepted in our community.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really fascinating to think that sort of on one level, the identities are honored and are protected, and yet it does not necessarily translate into a singular lived experience, especially outside. Thank you. That's really interesting. Moninne, do you have concerns about looking at some of this anti-LGBTQ legislation that's being introduced here in the States and how it might influence the global conversation? You mentioned a lot of positive stuff happening, which was really good to hear about. So I'd love to get your view on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you talk about American voices, American money, I mean, I have direct experience of that. As I was formerly before being CEO belonged to, I was Director of Marriage Equality in Ireland. And so, that we saw that those actors trying to influence the outcome of our referendum on marriage equality in Ireland. But luckily, we had made contact with activists, marriage equality activists in the US. And so we kind of forearmed, right? So we knew the messaging that they were going to use. And in some ways that, we're talking, that was like 7-8 years ago, we were nearly ahead of the posse, ahead of the anti-LGBT rights people in terms of our use of technology and that. And so we were able to dispel some of the myths and the red herrings very quickly, get ahead of that messaging. I think what's different this time around, and where that messaging is leaking into the Irish discussions, the Irish media, and especially on social media, the difference being this time that I feel we may be in the back foot in terms of use or abuse of social media to spread fake news. And so we're playing catch up. We have been lucky to talk to activists in the UK and the US, so that we are working on messaging, trying to put out the positive messaging ahead of the negative messaging, to get ahead of them. But it feels a bit different this time. I feel like we're playing catch up, but it's the same people, it's the same agenda, I suppose. They've lost on marriage equality, so now it's very much an anti-trans push that is where they're focusing their energies.
Wow. It's interesting. I never even thought about, not only could the bad legislation get exported, but we could also export some of the strategies that worked. And I never sort of considered the way that could show up, which saves a lot of time. But your point on the fake news is it's overwhelming. And there's so much research that is showing how damaging what is happening online is, especially to queer youth. Trevor Project had some numbers, and it was really, really devastating.
Heartbreaking, yeah, and we're seeing that here as well. And we know that online prejudice and bias and violence translates to offline violence as well. So we're seeing an increase of that, unfortunately, in Ireland, with 2 very recent murders of gay men. And so, I mean, they're extreme versions, but that kind of normalization of hate towards LGBTQ people, moving from online, where of course it can be very damaging and hurtful, to offline, where it can be physically damaging.
Absolutely fatal. So we like to make sure that at the end of every show, we are giving people something to do. We have a lot of PFLAGgers who watch and a lot of our allies who watch, and they're always looking for, now that I've learned something, how do I continue learning and stay up to date? And maybe, Aruna, we can start with you. Can you either name any resources that you would recommend to people so they can continue their learning, especially when it comes to the Southeast Asian space? And are there any behaviors, sort of ally behaviors, that you think would be helpful for people to start doing a little bit more, not just to be LGBTQ inclusive, but to be more inclusive of diverse communities inside of the LGBTQ space?
Yeah, no, there are so many resources. In India, there is actually an organization called Swikar, which is the PFLAG of India. It's essentially like trying to do this work with parents and families to promote acceptance. So I would urge you to follow them on social media. They're called Swikar Rainbow Parents. So they're definitely a great source. And in terms of behaviors, I think one of the things that is that's really been like sort of really helpful to me is for people to understand the kind of acculturation that happens to immigrants based on your immigration history. Like, for instance, I'm a foreign-born immigrant. My child was born and raised in the United States, and there's a big difference in our perspectives based on how we understand our own cultures and traditions. And I think one of the easiest things for people to do in allyship of LGBTQ folks who are from different cultural traditions than what they used to, is understand this level of acculturation. I know it's a complicated thing to ask, but to just put people in context and not assume that everybody is exactly the same just because they happen to be, brown skinned and have like a familiar sounding name.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it is a big conversation, but I also think you got to start somewhere. And I think this is such a good place to start. Moninne, recommendations for people, either resources or a behavior or two that you think people should start or stop doing?
Yeah, I mean, well, our website, we've plenty of resources there, and videos and materials people can download and watch and learn more about what's going on in Ireland. About being good allies, I mean, I think there's always more that we can learn. It's a continuous journey. I'm learning, and I work in the community, so I think it's about reading as much as you can, educating yourself all the time, and then just I think there are visual cues that you can do. I mean, as we have up on the screen after our names, using your pronouns. It's a simple way of starting a conversation when people go, "Why are you using your pronouns?" And you can talk about that, and just opening up the conversation about privilege and about unconscious bias and stuff like that. It's those one-to-one conversations with peers, with friends, with colleagues that are the most persuasive, and that ripple out effect can be enormous. So all those small little pieces of action can make a big difference in the end.
Thank you so much. Aruna, Moninne, thank you so much for spending time with us and telling us about the work that's happening. Please come back again and let us know what else is going on in your spaces. We really appreciate all of the work that you do, and especially spending some time doing some education with us.
Pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, everybody, as usual, I talked too long. It just gets so interesting. We will be back next week with another episode of Something to Talk About Live. If between now and then you need some help, make sure you visit pflag.org/find to locate your nearest chapter. Also, while you're there, remember to read with love. So pflag.org/read-with-love to learn about how you can replenish the disappearing books from library bookshelves. My name is Jean Marie Navetta. I will see you next week. We remind everybody at the end of every show to run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, be kind. We'll see you next week, everyone.